All right. We're back. You know, you've heard me talking about this militarization of police before. But every day there's another monster story out about how law enforcement is so far out of control at this point that they're ruling, and they've actually become dangerous to America. Now, there's two stories in here I'm going to talk about today. Actually, three, but let's get on the first one just to get it out of the way. This takes political correctness to an insane extent, but it does show you the concept of how everything has become a police matter in the United States of America. There was a 6-year-old boy the other day who kissed a girl on the cheek. On the cheek now. He was a 6-year-old boy. He kissed a girl on the cheek, and the school is saying they're going to charge him with sexual harassment. Now, the boy says, it was during class, yeah. We were doing reading group, and I leaned over and kissed her on the hand. That's what happened. The school says, well, it's happened once before, and we need to teach him a lesson. So we need to charge him with sexual harassment so that it goes into his permanent record so that he understands that he can't do this. The superintendent of the school said, the focus needs to be on his behavior. We usually try to get the student to stop. But if it continues, we need to take action. And it sometimes rises to the level of suspension. The kid is 6. Here's what the mother says. This is taking it to an extreme that doesn't need to be met with a 6-year-old. Now my son is asking questions like, what is sex, Mommy? That should not ever be said. Sex. Not in a sentence with a 6-year-old. That's the... And we heard the other day a story about a boy who drew back an imaginary bow and loosed an imaginary arrow and was suspended for criminal threat, terroristic threats against another student. I don't know, he's 6 or 8 years old. He had just finished watching that movie, whatever that movie is out with the girl who runs around with a bow. And he went into school and he was playing around with his buddy and he went, wow, wow, wow. Next thing you know, he's suspended from school for terroristic threats, for an imaginary bow and an imaginary arrow. That, ladies and gentlemen, is where I'm talking about when I say that we have taken everything to a legal level. Everything now is a criminal matter. Here's a story, and then we're going to get into the main body here. This story comes out of New York State. In New York City, in Staten Island. This New York Police Department went into a woman's home and they beat the family up physically. And when they were pushing the wife around, they knocked a bird cage off of a dresser and then they stomped on the parakeet on purpose to kill it. They beat up the wife. They also beat 2 of her sons, her daughter, and another family friend. On September 2nd, 2012, they entered the home, and the family was celebrating Labor Day. The cops stopped outside the home, and they questioned the son because he was outside taking out the garbage. They asked him for his identification. He refused to show him any, and the officer grabbed his right arm, and the kid broke free and ran into the house. So the cops came, and they broke out the windows in the home. And when the woman opened the front door, she was thrown outside by the police. They struck the guy 2 or 3 times with a hard object, struck their friend in the face, and threw the woman into the dresser with the birdcage. Then the cops pepper sprayed her daughter and her son. The son, the daughter, and the family friend were all arrested, and all 3 were taken to Staten Island University Hospital. They were treated for This is the family now. They were treated for multiple facial lacerations and lacerations to the head. The daughter was treated for an asthma attack. What could possibly have generated this kind of police brutality? Well, here's where the rub comes. The charges were all dropped against the family. But when the judge dropped them, he sealed the case. Do you know why? Because once the case is sealed, it can never be open to public view again. And they didn't want... Now, look, if these people had done something wrong, they should have been charged, right? I mean, if there was real criminal activity on their part that authorized and warranted these officers kicking in the door, beating the family up, killing their pet, pepper spraying them and macing them in the face, beating them up, causing facial and lacerations on their faces and their heads, they should have been charged. But the judge sealed the records so that nobody could know. The city's law department will not say why the police entered the home last year. And they won't say what charges were lodged against the family but later dropped. They did say, well, we're reviewing the case. You see, the real problem here is that now everything and every part of American life has become a matter for law enforcement. There's a story out there on motherjones.com. I'm not a big fan of Mother Jones, but there are times when I find an article that they do interesting. And I read a lot of stuff, you know? I mean, I read a lot of articles. And, you know, part of being a critical thinker is reading things from places that you don't necessarily agree with. I don't agree with most of what Mother Jones has to say about environmental issues and that kind of thing. They're very radical and very extremist. But I got to tell you, lately, folks, if you'll notice, it's not the conservative class of the political elite that is defending your rights to privacy and liberty and freedom and all those things. It's the left. And that ought to tell you something. What it should tell you is that neither the left nor the right are totally on your side. You're just food for them. You're livestock to be bought and sold and traded, milked, sheared, and occasionally, when your usefulness expires, culled. This story starts with a very, very interesting sentence, and I'm going to just give it to you because it really sets the tone. If all you've got is a hammer, then everything starts to look like a nail. And if police and prosecutors are your only tool, sooner or later, everything and everyone will be treated as criminal. This is increasingly the American way of life, a path that involves solving social problems and even some non-problems by throwing cops at them, with generally disastrous results. Wall-to-wall criminal law encroaches ever more on everyday life as police power is applied in ways that would have been unthinkable just a generation ago. This is a worthwhile article. It's up on our Facebook page. It's up on our americasvoicenow.org page. If you're watching this on YouTube, it will be, there's a link to it in the section that's the description of the show. You got to scroll down. You know, hit that show more button, and it will drop that thing down, and you can see all the stuff I put in there. And on every program I do, I always put those links in there so that you can follow along and do. Because listen, my job is not to tell you what to think. My job is to give you enough seed that you can go out and plant it and grow your own crop. But I want you to be a critical thinker, and so you'll see me post things in there sometimes that will say, this is the opposite of what I was talking about in the program, but I wanted you to see it anyway. The problem that we have now is that the war on crime, the war on drugs, the war on terror has become the war on America. We are consistently now the enemy. And you're the enemy for everything from your local police force as you're driving around town to the national government. You see, these items of war on crime, war on drugs, war on poverty, war on all these wars, first of all, ought to tell you right off the bat that when you have the term war, if you have a war on crime, that's a war on that segment of the population that commits crime. The problem is that most crime today in the United States is really not crime. It's rule breaking of some rule that shouldn't exist in the first place. I hearken you back to the segment I just did on the EPA. I mean, the crime of not wearing your seatbelt is not really a crime. It may be a crime to yourself because if you get in an automobile accident and you go flying through the windshield, it's your own fault. But it's not really a crime. If there's no victim, there's no crime. And that applies to drugs, and it applies to things like prostitution. You mean you support prostitution? No. I'm just saying it's not my place to tell you what to do. And if you and someone else choose to engage in that, it's not a crime because you're not affecting me and you're not hurting someone else. See, under common law, the only time that you are actually responsible for a crime is when you have impacted someone else's property, possessions, value, or their rights. And who you sleep with is not my business, and you're not affecting my rights at all. How you do it and where you do it and what you ingest into your body. Listen, if you want to take ecstasy until your brain melts, that's up to you. I'm not responsible for your medical bills, by the way. I'm also not responsible for your medical bills if you choose to ride a motorcycle without a helmet. It's not my place to give you a ticket for doing so. But it's also not my place to say, and it's not your place to say I should pay for your medical bills when you fall, as inevitably at some point on a motorcycle you will. And because you're not wearing a helmet, you crack your coconut and you want me to fix it. I'm not going to do that. That's your fault. You should have bought insurance. By the same token, if I'm not affecting you in some way, shape, or form, and I'm not demonizing your rights or injuring you in terms of property or revenue or value, then these issues are not issues. I don't support prostitution. I don't think it's necessarily a good thing for people to engage in. But it's not my place to tell anybody else what to do. It's only my place to decide for myself. I don't take drugs. But if you want to, you can. You should be allowed to. If you choose to do it in moderation and, once a month you sit down and you have a couple of beers with a friend or two and you smoke a joint, that's not my place to tell you yes or no, you can or cannot do that. It's not my place to tell you yes or no, you can or cannot do that if you do that twice a day, every day. If that's all you do, it's still not my place. But bear in mind, it's also not my place to give you food stamps. It's also not my responsibility to give you medical care. It's also not my responsibility to pay your rent. And it's not my responsibility to make sure that you've got heat in your home. If you are a chronic pothead and all you do is sit around and get stoned all day and you refuse to go out and find yourself a job and you refuse to participate in society, that is your fault. And you alone are responsible for your actions. See, that's the libertarian philosophy. And the truth of the matter is, if you look at it in its truest sense, it requires that you be, one, self-reliant, self-responsible, and self-governing. What do you mean by self-governing? Well, it's not my place to govern you. It's your place to govern you. It's your place to govern your own impulses. If you cannot control your animal impulse, that's your problem. But it's not mine. Nor will I pay for your blunders. You see, the vast majority of rules and laws that we have on the books today are not real crime. I mean, look, I'm all for taking somebody off the street when they commit a murder, when they commit a robbery, when they commit an act of assault. But don't tell me that these heavily armed SWAT teams who are kicking in people's doors and these, the concept of handing a small town of 15,000 people an MRAP is necessary. An up-armored military vehicle to go serve warrants on somebody who's got a poker game going in their basement once a week. You got to be kidding me. Or you're going to go and do a no-knock raid to go in there and get, some kid who's got 3 joints because some stoolie gave you some information that was false. There's a book out there called The Rise of the Warrior Cop. It's by a guy by the name of Radley Balco, and I've read it. And I got to tell you, if you ever read Balco's book, you will be angry and frightened. You will be frightened because you'll recognize for the first time how far down this rabbit hole we've fallen. Now, he has a blog out there. I'll give you his web address because you may not be able to gain access to the book, but you can still find his website. He actually writes, I believe, for the Huffington Post, if I'm not mistaken. He writes articles from them from time to time. But he, if I can find his website. Anyway, my point is this. Do your own homework. It's Radley Balco. Radley is Radley, and his last name is Balco. B like Bravo, Alko. The problem that we have is that everything now has become a matter for law enforcement to deal with. Whether it's your 6-year-old who kisses the little girl sitting in the next desk over on the cheek because he likes her. Or whether, your 8-year-old shoots an imaginary arrow from an imaginary bow at an imaginary opponent because he just watched a movie last night with the family about, how heroes use bows. The normal stuff that kids are doing in schools is being criminalized. And yet, when you look at what's going on in schools in places like the cities, these kids are out of control. I mean, they're threatening teachers. They're physically assaulting teachers. They're cursing at teachers, and they have there is zero discipline in schools. Until it comes to something like a kid who hugs another kid. I remember when one of my kids was younger, and I was in middle school, they had this thing where no student was allowed to touch another student. And, these days, kids will walk up and they'll give each other a hug and all that kind of thing. So what these kids would do is they would walk up and they would give each other what was the invisible hug. So they'd put their arms around each other but never actually physically touch. And I thought to myself, it was 7th grade or something like that. And I thought to myself, that's a little silly. But when we talk now about the fact that things are felonies for the most ridiculous stuff, and everybody is becoming a felon, the prisons are jammed full. We have the highest prison population in the world. We have 5% of the global population and 25% of the world's prison population. 25% of all the people incarcerated in the planet are right here in the United States. We have more felons in the United States than all the rest of the world combined. Why? You see, most of the stuff that people are being felonized for aren't real crimes at all. But what happens when you do classify someone as a felon? Well, all right. See, there really lies the crux in the answer to this conundrum. Why do they want? Well, first of all, if you do go into the prison system, that's an entire industry. It's like the military-industrial complex, but it's called the prison-industrial complex. There are an awful lot of people that make their living on law enforcement and the prosecution and the imprisonment and the blah, 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 blah. It keeps an awful lot of people engaged in work. Lawyers and judges and prosecutors and probation officers and prison guards. And I mean, there's an enormous, and not to mention the fact that a lot of prisons have work facilities there. In the federal prison system, they actually have a corporation called Unicor, which is a for-profit company, and all the inmates work there as employees. Well, not all of them. You have to actually beg to work there. And they pay you 12 cents an hour. And here's the problem. They make a profit. But guess what? The only stockholders are the federal pension owners, including judges, and they're all in the law enforcement arena. So it's the prosecutors and the judges and so forth and so on. It's a public company, but you can't buy the stock unless you're a judge or a prosecutor. And their only client, by the way, is the federal government. It's a rigged game. So what we have is a situation where, assuming for argument's sake that, all these law enforcement agencies, which constantly need more money, and then once they get you and nab you for whatever the alleged crime is, then they run you through the prison industrial complex system or the justice industrial complex system. Then when you get out, you got to go through the probation industrial complex system. And they got people watching over you, making you pee in a cup when you weren't even there for a drug charge. I mean, it's like, why would I pee in a cup? Well, everybody has to. Okay, but you didn't arrest me for drugs, so why do I have to pee in a cup? I mean, the absurdity of that is just beyond me. They're hoping that they can get you on drug, with a drug in your system so that they can bring you back into the system. You get it? But here's the most important part of this whole thing. At the end of the day, what really matters is, once they've made you a felon, you are prohibited from a lot of things in society, not the least of which is exercising your Second Amendment right. And to make matters even worse, not only are you prohibited from exercising your Second Amendment right, but everyone who lives in your household, because there can be no firearm in your premise where you live. And so if you're a husband and you've got a wife and you have a felony from back when you were 22 years old and you got caught with a half ounce of weed, and you're now 50, and you got a great job and you got children and you got, you go to church every Sunday and you haven't even gotten a speeding ticket in the last 15, 20 years, you're prohibited from owning a gun, and so is your wife, and so are your children. It's a way of applying a repeal of the Second Amendment without actually repealing it. And the threat of going to prison for the possession of that gun is the gun held to your head. The fines, extravagant. The problem is that now everything in the United States is become a police state matter. And that's why we now live in a police state America. It's the tragedy of militarization and the rise of tyranny. And make no mistake about it, that's exactly what it is. All right, we're going to wrap for the day. Do me a favor and do yourself a favor. Call the battery station at 303 Washington Avenue, and they are raising some goods that they need for the D Company 1/8 Cav Reapers stationed in Afghanistan. They send them packages every year. Call them at 417-257-7799. or email them at troops@batterystation.com and ask them what they still need donation-wise. They need baby wipes and stuff like that. These guys don't take showers for weeks, right? They need unscented wipes, and they need snacks and food and, foil tuna pouches and stuff like that. BatteryStation.com. You can email them troops@batterystation.com, or you can call 417-257-7799 and make sure that you're doing your part for that group. You're listening to America's Voice Now. Find us on the web at americasvoicenow.org and share it with your friends. We'll see you tomorrow morning bright and early.